James wiped a thick smear of black grease from his knuckles with a ragged, oil-stained cloth. The scent of motor oil hung heavy in the air, clinging to the back of his throat and settling into his skin like a second layer that no soap could ever fully scrub away. Outside, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, but inside the bay, the light remained the same, harsh, flickering yellow. For 30 years, the rhythmic, metallic clatter of heavy wrenches against engine blocks had been the only soundtrack he knew. It was a language of tightening bolts and failing parts. He dropped the rag onto the workbench, the sound lost in the cooling hiss of a radiator. His hands were mapped with small, jagged scars and calluses that had hardened over 3 decades of labor. He looked at the rows of tools hanging on the pegboard, each one worn smooth by his own palm. The garage was quiet now, save for the hum of a distant ventilation fan. He stood still for a moment, listening to the silence of the shop, feeling the deep, familiar ache in his lower back that marked the end of another day spent bent over iron and steel. 30 years of this. Every day, the same cycle of grime and torque. The memory surfaced with the sharp clarity of a sudden ignition. He was 23 again, his palms clean, standing in the exact same bay. The air was loud with the complaints of the others. They stood around the break table, voices overlapping in a dissonant chorus of overdue bills and credit card statements. One man slammed a stack of past due notices onto a toolbox, the paper crinkling under the force. Another leaned against a transmission jack, counting loose change and shaking his head at the total. They lived in a cycle of immediate consumption, their paychecks devoured before the ink on the stub even dried. James leaned against a workbench, his own pockets empty, listening to the weight of their words. He looked at the grease-stained floor and realized he was standing at a fork in the road. The shop was a trap of small choices that compounded into a lifetime of stagnation. He watched them pace, watched them worry, and felt the cold reality of their situation settle into his chest. He was young, he was broke, and he was surrounded by the evidence of a future he did not want to inhabit. He stood there, silent, waiting for a way out. James walked across the concrete floor toward the back corner where Frank sat. The older man occupied a small stool, his back to the wall, methodically working through a thick sandwich. Around them, the shop remained a cacophony of clanking metal and frustrated voices, but Frank seemed to exist in a pocket of calm. James stopped a few feet away. He looked down at his own empty palms, then back at the veteran mechanic. He gestured vaguely toward the men still arguing about their mounting debts. Frank didn't rush. He took a final bite, chewed slowly, and set the sandwich down on a clean paper towel. He wiped his fingers and looked up, his eyes locking onto James with the intensity of someone who had seen every mistake a young man could make. Frank leaned forward, the movement slow and deliberate. He spoke, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the shop with absolute clarity. "Pay yourself first," he said. The words hung in the air, simple and heavy. James stared back, the noise of the shop fading into a dull hum. He felt the weight of the advice settle into his mind. It was a single, clean instruction that severed his connection to the cycle of debt he had been watching all morning. James left the shop before the sun hit the high windows. He walked 3 blocks to the local bank, his hands deep in his pockets. The lobby was quiet, smelling of floor wax and stale air. He approached the counter and placed a small stack of bills on the marble surface. It was a meager sum, barely enough to cover a week of groceries, but it represented everything he had managed to scrape together. The teller did not look up, her fingers clicking rapidly against a keyboard. She counted the bills, smoothed them flat, and fed them into a drawer with a sharp, metallic snap. James watched the transaction with a steady gaze. He signed the deposit slip, the pen scratching loudly in the hollow silence of the room. When the receipt slid back across the marble, he picked it up. The paper was thin, cold to the touch, and held the record of his first investment. He looked at the number written in ink. It was not enough to change his world today, but it was the first time he had chosen his future over his present. He folded the slip into his wallet, felt the weight of it against his hip, and stepped back out into the bright afternoon heat. Back in the garage, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber and the loud, boastful talk of his peers. A coworker pulled into the lot, revving a new engine that gleamed under the midday sun. The other mechanics crowded around, running hands over the finish, their voices high with envy and hollow praise. James stood by his own workbench, the cold steel of a wrench in his palm. He looked at his coworkers, then back to the oily engine block in front of him. The temptation pulled at him like a physical weight. He knew the feeling of that new metal, the status it bought, the immediate validation of a purchase. He watched them trade stories of loans and credit cycles, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls. James tightened his grip on his tools and turned away, focusing his gaze on the broken machine parts waiting for repair. He kept his head down, his movements deliberate and quiet. While they spent their days chasing the appearance of wealth, he retreated into the shadows of the shop. He chose to remain invisible, burying his focus deep into his work. Every minute spent in the garage was a test of his resolve, and he chose to keep his secret, letting his money grow in silence while the world around him clamored for attention. The summer heat turned the garage into a furnace. Sweat beaded on James's forehead, dripping onto the concrete as he disassembled an alternator. The shop foreman walked the floor, handing out envelopes the quarterly bonus. A cheer rippled through the bay. Coworkers immediately began debating new rims, weekend trips, and high-end tools they did not need. One leaned over to James, wiping grease from his brow. "What are you getting, James? A new truck? A vacation?" James held the envelope. The paper felt heavy, thin, and full of potential. He looked at the flickering light above his bench, then at the faces of the others, already spending money they had not yet earned. He did not answer. He slid the envelope into his pocket, his movements sharp and controlled. He finished the repair, washed the oil from his hands until the skin turned raw and clean, and left the shop early. He walked to the bank, the pavement radiating heat through his soles. He stood before the terminal, his fingers steady as he navigated the transfer. He watched the numbers shift on the screen. He was not buying a temporary comfort or a shiny distraction. He was buying hours of his own future. He hit confirm, walked out into the cooling evening, and felt the weight of the day lift. Years began to blur into a single, seamless cycle. The rhythmic clatter of wrenches against engine blocks became the steady pulse of his life. Seasons changed outside the garage doors, but inside, the work remained constant. James grew older, his hands mapping every bolt and gasket by instinct. He watched his peers cycle through phases of prosperity and sudden, desperate panic. When the markets dipped and the news screens flickered with red charts, the shop would erupt in frantic speculation. His coworkers paced the concrete, eyes wide, voices strained by the fear of losing what they had built. James did not join them. He kept his head under the hood, his focus anchored to the engine he was repairing. He heard the anxiety in their voices, but he let it wash over him like background noise. He treated his investment portfolio as a secondary life force, one that grew in the dark, untouched by the volatile moods of the room. While others looked for the next quick gain, he simply stayed the course. The money worked in silence, compounding through weekends and holidays, building a foundation that no one else could see. He was a ghost in the machine, trading labor for time, watching his own freedom take shape one quiet deposit at a time. James developed a system that defied the shop culture around him. Every month, the moment his paycheck cleared, he treated his investment transfer with the same urgency as an electric bill. It was not optional. It was not a surplus to be spent if nothing else came up. It was a debt he owed to his future self. He sat at his kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the wood, and divided his earnings before he even touched a single dollar for rent or food. This was the promise he made at 23, and he refused to break it. There were months when the car needed a major repair or the utility bills spiked, and the temptation to skip the transfer clawed at him. He would stare at the bank interface, his thumb hovering over the button. The screen glowed, a cold, clinical reminder of his goal. He forced his hand to move. He hit the transfer. The money vanished from his checking account and moved into the brokerage, locked away in assets he could not touch. He learned to live on what remained, adjusting his lifestyle to fit the reality of his reduced balance. He did not call it sacrifice. He called it survival. By treating his financial future as a mandatory obligation, he ensured that no matter how hard the months became, his path to freedom remained paved. The shop floor buzzed with the latest rumors of get-rich-quick schemes. Men leaned against workbenches, coffee cups in hand, debating the merits of obscure stocks with the intensity of gamblers. James kept his head buried deep under the hood of a sedan, his focus fixed on the intricate clockwork of the engine. He let their voices fade into the background. He didn't chase their trends or share their frantic energy. He tightened a bolt, wiped his hands, and felt the weight of his own progress. The isolation he once felt had shifted into something solid. It was no longer a loneliness, but a private sanctuary. He moved through the garage with a deliberate, measured pace that his peers lacked. When they looked at him, they saw only a man covered in grease, bent over another broken machine. They did not see the portfolio that was quietly, steadily eclipsing their combined efforts. He felt the heat of the summer sun through the skylights, but it didn't bother him. He was building his own shadow, a structure of assets that existed entirely outside the chaos of the room. He didn't need to speak, and he didn't need to explain. He stood up, wiped the final streak of oil from his thumb, and smiled at the silence he had cultivated. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a man who knew exactly where he was going. The rhythm of the shop broke on a Tuesday. It started with a low hum of chatter near the break room, then spread to the service base. Men who usually focused on timing belts and transmission flushes were now huddled around glowing mobile screens, their expressions tightening. The air in the garage felt heavy, stripped of its usual mechanical focus. James tightened a spark plug, the metal clicking into place, but he could feel the shift in the room. A coworker walked past his bay, eyes glued to a ticker, shaking his head at a sudden downward tick. Then, the foreman stepped out of the office, his brow furrowed, and signaled for a brief pause in the workflow. He spoke of volatility, of numbers bleeding red, and of the uncertainty creeping into the broader economy. The crew responded with frantic questions, their voices rising in pitch. Some paced the concrete floor, fingers twitching as if they could still manipulate the numbers. James remained at his bench, his hands steady. He watched them scramble, their panic manifesting in dropped tools and sharp, aggressive movements. He picked up his rag, wiped his fingers, and listened to the mounting noise. The stability he had built over decades was about to be tested, but for now, he simply observed the first tremors of the storm. The news hit the shop like a physical shockwave. Screens didn't just flicker anymore. They bled red. A collective groan rose from the service bays, a raw, jagged sound of disbelief. A coworker slammed his hand against a metal workbench, the impact echoing off the high rafters. Another man let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like glass breaking. The air turned stifling, thick with the scent of ozone and spilled coffee. The foreman stood in the center of the bay, his face drained of color, staring at his tablet until it slipped from his grip and hit the concrete. The screen spiderwebbed into 1,000 shards. Nobody moved to pick it up. The tools lay abandoned on the floors, half-finished repairs left to rust in the sudden paralysis. Fear moved through the room, visible in the hunched shoulders and the frantic, darting eyes of men who had bet everything on the climb. They shouted over each other, voices cracking, demanding answers from a market that had already stopped listening. The garage, once a place of calculated labor, had become a tomb for their expectations. James looked at the wreckage of their hope, his own hands still gripping his wrench, anchored in the silence of the storm. While the rest of the crew paced the oil-stained concrete, James walked to the break room computer. The screen was bathed in the same frantic red as the others, but his pulse remained slow. He logged into his brokerage account. The numbers on the display showed a sharp, violent decline, a terrifying drop that had sent his peers into a spiral of shouting and disbelief. James did not look at the news feeds. He did not check the forums. He opened his bank portal, typed in the transfer amount, and hit confirm. He moved more money into the market than he had in any single month before. It felt like walking into a gale force wind, but his feet stayed planted. He treated the investment like a non-negotiable electric bill, a debt he owed to his future self. Behind him, a coworker collapsed into a chair, head buried in his hands, lamenting the lost equity. James closed the browser, stood up, and adjusted his grip on his tools. He walked back to his engine block, the silence of his resolve cutting through the din of the shop. He had just bought a larger piece of his own time, while everyone around him was busy selling theirs for the price of fear. The years had carved deep lines into James's face, but his focus remained sharp. He was 46, standing at his usual station, when he pulled his quarterly statement from his back pocket. The paper was stiff and clean, a stark contrast to the grease-slicked steel of the engine he had just rebuilt. He unfolded it under the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage. He scanned the figures, his thumb tracing the line of growth. Then he stopped. He looked at the total, then looked at his pay stub from the shop. The numbers did not just match. The investment returns had overtaken his wages. He read them again, counting the digits, his breath hitching in his throat. It was not a sudden windfall, but a quiet, mathematical inevitability. He set the paper on the workbench, his hand trembling slightly against the cool metal. For 3 decades, his body had been the primary engine of his survival. Now, that engine was secondary. He looked around the garage at the other men, their backs bent, their movements labored and tired. He felt the weight of his own hands, the callous skin, the ache in his shoulders, and realized he no longer had to trade those physical costs for his existence. The math had flipped. The balance of power had shifted from his muscles to his capital. James returned to his work, but the rhythm of his life had fundamentally altered. He went to sleep on a Tuesday, and when he woke on Wednesday, his net worth had moved forward by more than his daily wage. It happened again on the weekend while the garage gates were locked and the air inside was still. It happened through holidays when the shop was empty and the tools sat cold on the racks. He watched the cycles repeat. The compounding effect was no longer a theoretical projection on a spreadsheet. It was a physical force he could track. He spent his days pulling bolts and cleaning oil filters, yet his capital was operating on a different clock. It never tired. It never requested a break. It never needed a paycheck to survive. He began to see his life in 2 parallel tracks. One was the physical labor of the shop, predictable and finite. The other was the digital growth of his assets, accelerating with a momentum he no longer had to push. It was a silent, relentless machine that fed itself. Every time he added a small contribution, the engine grew larger, its output compounding against the friction of the market. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was the architect of a system that operated whether he was under the hood or resting at home. The weight of his future began to lift, replaced by the steady, invisible hum of his wealth expanding in the dark. The garage buzzed with the latest market rumors. His coworkers huddled around a flickering monitor, voices rising in excitement over a volatile stock that promised overnight gains. They talked of timing the market and gambling on the next big breakout. James kept his head down, his wrench tightening a bolt on a cylinder head. He heard the chatter, but he did not look up. He had seen these cycles before. The same men who chased the loudest hype were the same men who panicked when the charts turned red. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened his brokerage app. He did not look for trends. He did not chase the speculative spikes. He executed his routine purchase, moving his monthly savings into the same boring, reliable assets he had held for decades. The transaction confirmed with a simple, quiet click. While the others argued about which stock would make them rich by Friday, James focused on the engine in front of him. His plan was not exciting. It was not fast. It was simply inevitable. He ignored the noise, the tips, and the hollow promises of quick wealth. He maintained his course, treating his investment like a non-negotiable electric bill. By the time he wiped his hands clean, the market had shifted, and his portfolio had grown again, anchored by the discipline of 30 years. He had built a fortress of stability, while the others were building castles out of sand. The calendar turned, and James hit 55. The air in the shop smelled exactly as it had 3 decades ago: burnt rubber, cold iron, and the sharp bite of solvent. But the weight in his chest had shifted. He walked to the back of the bay, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. His toolbox stood in the corner, a heavy, familiar presence that had anchored his life since he was a novice. He reached out and touched the handle. It was cool, worn smooth by thousands of repetitions. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the hum of the air compressor and the distant clatter of sockets. This was the final time. He took a breath, gripped the metal latch, and pulled. The mechanism gave way with a sharp, metallic click that cut through the noise of the shop. The lid swung back, revealing the rows of wrenches, ratchets, and drivers nestled in their foam inserts. He looked at the tools, then back at the shop floor. He did not rush. He began to organize, placing each piece into his kit with the same deliberate precision he had used for 30 years. Every movement was a clean break from the past. The shop was still busy, still loud, still demanding, but he was no longer part of its internal clock. He closed the lid on his labor, the final latch echoing like a gavel closing a long, complex case. The sound of the latching toolbox drew eyes from across the bay. One by one, the younger mechanics stopped their work, wrenches hanging limp in their hands. They watched James move with a fluid, unhurried pace, placing his gear into the case. The air in the garage grew thin, heavy with the weight of the transition. They had seen men retire before, but never with this specific kind of quiet finality. One of the newer hires drifted over, wiped his palms on a rag, and stopped a few feet away. He scanned the expensive equipment James was packing, his eyes narrowing. The envy was palpable, a sharp, bitter edge in the way he stood. He looked at the tools, then at the garage doors, then back at James. He could not process the math of how a man who had spent 30 years turning bolts in the same bay was suddenly walking away to a life of his own design. He stepped closer, his voice strained by a mix of confusion and frustration. "What stock made you rich?" he asked. The question hung in the air, blunt and desperate. Around him, the other crew members crowded in, their faces tight, waiting for the name of the golden ticket, the hidden trade, the secret maneuver that had bypassed their own struggle. They were looking for a shortcut, a ticker symbol, a miracle. James stood still, his hand resting on the handle of his kit, and let the silence stretch until the hum of the shop seemed to fade into nothing. James felt the collective breath of the room hitch. They expected a ticker symbol, a whispered name of a tech giant or a volatile commodity. They were hungry for an edge, for a way to skip the decades of grinding labor they currently faced. He looked at them, not with pity, but with the clarity of a man who had seen the cycle repeat for 30 years. He lifted his hand from the metal handle and tapped his own chest, right over his heart. The sound was a dull, rhythmic thud against his ribs. "No stock," James said, his voice steady and low, cutting through the shop noise. "Just a promise I kept to myself for 30 years. The men shifted on their feet, glancing at each other, waiting for the punchline, for the real investment strategy to follow. None came. He watched the realization ripple through the group, the sudden, heavy weight of understanding that there was no shortcut, only the long, grueling process of self-discipline. He had not gambled his way to this exit. He had built it, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, through the quiet, unglamorous work of saying no to the immediate to secure the eventual. The room fell into a deeper, more uncomfortable silence, the air suddenly stripped of its frantic energy, replaced by the stark, undeniable truth of his path. James reached out, his hand calloused and firm, and gripped the palms of the younger men one by one. There was no need for further explanation. The lesson had been delivered, and now it was time for them to reconcile it with their own choices. He turned away from the huddle, his movements deliberate and devoid of the haste that usually defined the end of a shift. He reached down and gripped the handle of his toolbox. The heavy metal, which had felt like a burden for 3 decades, now felt balanced and manageable. He stood straight, his back finally unburdened by the constant hunch over engine blocks. He began to walk. The concrete floor, stained with layers of oil and coolant, felt different beneath his boots as he moved toward the exit. He did not look back at the bay, the scattered wrenches, or the flickering fluorescent lights that had dominated his life. The air grew cooler, shifting from the heavy, recycled atmosphere of the garage to the crisp, open currents waiting outside. With every step, the rhythmic clatter of the shop faded, replaced by the rising hum of the world beyond the threshold. He reached the heavy garage doors, his hand finding the edge of the frame, and pulled himself forward into the transition. The light hit his eyes first, sharp and blinding compared to the dim interior. James stepped past the threshold, the transition instantaneous. He stopped on the asphalt outside, the heat of the sun pressing against his skin, a stark contrast to the recycled air he had breathed for 30 years. He set the heavy metal toolbox down on the ground with a final, decisive clatter. He did not pick it up again. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence of the afternoon, unencumbered by the roar of engines or the pressure of a ticking clock. The world ahead was wide, stretching out toward horizons he had only ever imagined from beneath the hood of a car. He took a breath, the air clean and deep. He began to walk, his stride steady, his shoulders relaxed. Behind him, the garage doors remained open, a relic of a life fully accounted for and completed. He moved forward, not toward a new task or a different shift, but into the quiet space of his own existence. Every step was his own. Every hour from this point forward belonged to him. He walked until the sound of the shop vanished entirely, leaving only the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat and the vast, open road ahead.